Are NATO and the EU partners, competitors? Are they both? Let's find out. Before we talk about the relationship between the EU and NATO, we have to understand its differences. NATO is a military alliance and is focusing upon security only, while the EU is focusing upon a few more things. Yeah, they understand it. Faster, faster, and there we go. However, there's another difference, and that is its members. United States and Turkey are not members of the EU, but they're members of NATO. And that's very important to remember when talking about the relationship of these two organizations. The reason why the US is significant to this discussion is because the US have the largest military in the world and thus is the most important member of NATO. But also because of the election of President Trump in 2016, which strained the relationship between the EU and the United States. Now, the reason why Turkey is important in this discussion is due to the strained relationship that Turkey and the EU have. When President Erdogan began to consolidate his power within Turkey by lessening the democratic institutions and its powers, prosecuting the opposition, and making a military operation against northern Syria, which was where Western-backed allies were located. This led even President Macron, the French president, to call NATO brain dead when one of its own members have attacked NATO allies. Now let's first clarify what we mean when we say competitor. The idea being that NATO and the EU are competing against being the most useful institution for its member states when it comes to security policy. A real-world consequence for the EU where this idea is in practice would be in 2021, where President Macron suggested to the European Council that they wanted to create a EU military consisting of 20,000 soldiers. However, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, slammed the proposal by stating that she will never allow a stronger Europe at the expense of a strong transatlantic cooperation. Thus, it's clear that some member states do think that if the EU becomes stronger in security, it means that NATO becomes weaker, and thus we have a competitor. Now, another argument of why NATO and the EU is competitors is that due to the existence of NATO, it lessens the ambitions of Europe to do more security policies, because they always have NATO. Now, this is a specific point that Dr. Bishop, a European security scholar, is especially critical of, because right now, EU is putting all their eggs in one basket, which is called the US security guarantee. And what would happen if that guarantee would be lost? Now, these arguments do have validity to them. After all, with the election of President Trump and Brexit, the European Union made huge strides in security policies in an impressively short time. Thus, it can be argued that whether you are for or against EU security policy, then NATO can definitely be seen as a competitor to the European Union in this area of policy. But is that the entire story? Now, of course, the EU and NATO are partners. After all, many of the same countries is in both organizations. So if anyone was to attack an EU member state, then they would most likely draw in NATO, and vice versa. However, what we wanted to find out is what is the exact relationship between the EU and NATO? How much do they cooperate, and on what? And historically, it's not been the most impressive ride. For example, when the EU started making an organization related to security, it took 7 years before they even had an official meeting with NATO as an organization to organization. Though the EU and NATO has already cooperated on several places around the world, especially Kosovo, the Mediterranean Sea, Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, the two ladders is not necessarily a recipe for success. It has to be said that these operations has primarily been where NATO was a peacekeeping partner and the EU were a state-building partner, making initiatives like building roads, schools, etc. However, in 2016, the EU and NATO made a joint declaration that had 74 different proposals on how to secure a better strategic partnership. Now, don't worry, we won't go through them one by one, but it will deal with stuff like cybersecurity, how to deal with hybrid threats, increasing defense research and the industry, and much more that you can find down in the description below. But the biggest and most important thing to take away from this is that the progress of this proposal is actually going really well, as shown in a report in 2021. So, there are hope after all. Now, some may see the EU and NATO as competitors. That was certainly the case with the presidency of Donald Trump, where if the EU got strong, then the NATO got weaker. But this has not always been the political stance of the US. In 1952, there was a proposal of creating a common European army to resist the Soviet Union. And this was heavily supported by the United States. Ironically, the reason why it didn't go through was because France blocked it. But this is just a great example to illustrate how perceptions and interest changes throughout time. In 1952, a common European army was seen as a supplement or even a partner to NATO. It might be that once again. In conclusion, the relationship between the EU and NATO are indeed complicated. On one hand, you're going to say, well, they're partners. They're never cooperated as much in overseas and internal operations as they are right now. On the other hand, you can also say, well, they're competitors, especially if you have a very anti or very pro sentiment when it comes to EU and security matters, where you can see it's weakening NATO or weakening EU on these corporations. But then again, EU has never been stronger on security matters as it is right now. And there's never been such a strong relationship between the two organizations as there are right now, as seen with the 74 proposals and the progression of such. But one thing is for certain. The answer to our question, whether or not it's competitor or partner, it's kind of both. It all depends on the perception and agenda of the individual arguing. But as we said, it's all debatable, and we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for making this video a reality. And if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. My name is Kasper Langerlund, and remember, stay curious.